Constantinople, modern Istanbul, is a city of minarets, crowded ferries, glowing bazaars, and skylines where Europe stares directly across the water at Asia. Millions of people move through it every day, often without realizing they're walking through the graveyard of empires. Because nearly 3,000 years ago, this was not a world capital. It was just a modest Greek fishing colony called Byzantium, perched on a narrow strip of land beside a dangerous channel of water known as the Bosporus. Then came emperors, armies, crusaders, plagues, riots so violent they nearly destroyed civilization itself. Entire dynasties rose behind these walls believing their empire would last forever. Most of them were wrong. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople stood at the center of the known world. Whoever controlled this city controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia, the riches of the Black Sea, and one of the most strategically valuable positions on Earth. Romans fought for it. Persians threatened it. Arabs besieged it. Vikings guarded it. Crusaders betrayed it. And eventually, Ottoman cannons shattered its walls in one of the most consequential sieges in human history. But what makes Constantinople extraordinary isn't just how often it was attacked. It's how often it survived. Again and again, the city seemed doomed. And again, it endured. Sometimes through military brilliance. Sometimes through staggering wealth. Sometimes through sheer luck. According to medieval chroniclers, there were moments when people genuinely believed divine intervention had saved the city from destruction. Whether or not those stories are true, what matters is that Constantinople developed a reputation that bordered on mythological. To much of the medieval world, this wasn't simply a city. It was the city, the center of Christian civilization, the heir to Rome itself, and the scale of it was almost impossible for outsiders to comprehend. At a time when most European cities were muddy towns of timber houses and livestock, Constantinople had massive stone walls stretching for miles, enormous palaces covered in gold mosaics, libraries filled with ancient knowledge, and churches crowned with domes so large visitors could barely believe human beings had constructed them. Contemporary accounts describe foreign ambassadors entering the imperial court and leaving convinced they had witnessed something supernatural. But empires built on glory also accumulate enemies. Over the next 2 millennia, Constantinople would witness political murders, religious revolutions, economic collapse, civil wars, massacres, and apocalyptic invasions. Entire populations would be wiped out by disease. Emperors would be blinded, overthrown, or torn apart by mobs in the streets. The city would become the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, then the greatest prize of the Ottoman world, before transforming yet again into the modern megacity now called Istanbul. This is the story of how a small Greek settlement became the capital of empires, survived catastrophe after catastrophe, and reshaped the history of Europe, the Middle East, and the world itself. This is the entire history of Constantinople. Before Constantinople became the glittering capital of emperors and sultans, it was simply Byzantium, a small Greek colony founded around 657 BC by settlers from the city of Megara. According to legend, the settlers chose the site after consulting the Oracle of Delphi, who instructed them to build their city opposite the land of the blind. When they arrived at the Bosporus, they supposedly saw that earlier settlers across the water at Chalcedon had ignored the vastly superior harbor on the European side. To the Greeks, only blind men could have missed how valuable this location truly was. And honestly, they had a point. Byzantium sat beside one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. The Bosporus connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, meaning any ships carrying grain, timber, furs, or precious metals between Europe and Asia had to pass directly by the settlement. Historians believe this geographical advantage is the single biggest reason the city survived as long as it did. Even in its earliest days, Byzantium controlled trade, movement, and military access between continents. But life here was never easy. The colony spent centuries trapped between rival powers. Persian armies swept through the region during the Greco-Persian Wars. Later came Athens, Sparta, Macedon, and eventually Rome. Byzantium changed hands repeatedly, surviving not because it was powerful, but because it was useful. Every empire wanted control of the Bosporus, and over time, the city became rich. Its harbors filled with merchant ships from across the ancient world. Fish poured from the surrounding waters. Taxes flowed into the city from passing trade. Massive defensive walls rose around the settlement, because prosperity in the ancient world almost always attracted enemies. Then came Rome. By the 2nd century AD, Byzantium was firmly part of the Roman Empire, but it remained relatively modest compared to cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Antioch. That was about to change because the Roman world itself was beginning to fracture. Civil wars erupted. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Entire frontiers were collapsing under pressure from invading tribes. And in the middle of that chaos emerged one of the most consequential figures in human history, Constantine. In 324 AD, after defeating his final rival in a brutal civil war, Emperor Constantine the Great looked across the Roman Empire for a new capital. Rome itself was declining politically and strategically vulnerable. Constantine wanted something stronger, safer, closer to the empire's richest provinces and major trade routes. He chose Byzantium, and what happened next changed the city forever. Over the next 6 years, Constantine transformed the old Greek settlement into a new imperial capital. Temples, forums, palaces, baths, and massive defensive works rose across the peninsula. Thousands of statues and monuments were brought in from across the empire to decorate the city. In 330 AD, Constantine officially inaugurated what he called Nova Roma, New Rome. But history would remember it by another name, Constantinople. Constantine's new capital grows with astonishing speed. Workers flood into the city from across the empire. Marble arrives from Greece. Columns are stripped from ancient pagan temples and shipped across the Mediterranean. Vast forums appear along newly constructed avenues. Imperial palaces rise overlooking the sea. According to contemporary accounts, Constantine wanted Constantinople to rival Rome itself, not just politically, but psychologically. This city was meant to project permanence, power, destiny, and for a while it works. As the Western Roman Empire begins collapsing under the pressure of invasions and internal decay, Constantinople becomes the stable center of the Eastern Mediterranean. While Germanic tribes sack Rome in the west, the Eastern Empire survives. Wealth continues flowing through the Bosporus. Grain ships arrive from Egypt. Merchants crowd the harbors speaking Greek, Latin, Syriac, Armenian, and dozens of other languages. The city becomes one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth. But then Christianity transforms everything. Constantine himself had legalized Christianity before his death, and over the following decades Constantinople increasingly becomes the religious center of the Christian world. Massive churches rise across the city. Bishops gain political influence. Pagan temples gradually disappear. What had once been an imperial Roman capital is becoming something entirely new, a Christian imperial capital. And with religion comes conflict. Theological disputes explode across the empire with astonishing intensity. Arguments over the nature of Christ trigger riots, political crises, and church schisms. Emperors involve themselves directly in religious debates because in Constantinople, politics and faith are now inseparable. Historians often describe the Byzantine Empire as a civilization where theology could start revolutions. Then, in the 6th century, the city reaches its first true golden age under Emperor Justinian I. Justinian dreams of rebuilding the old Roman Empire. His generals reconquer huge territories across North Africa and Italy. Wealth pours into Constantinople. New aqueducts, palaces, and public buildings reshape the capital. But Justinian's greatest project begins after catastrophe. In 532 AD, the city erupts into chaos. What starts as tensions between rival chariot-racing factions inside the Hippodrome spirals into one of the deadliest urban uprisings in ancient history, the Nika riots. Crowds flood the streets, chanting victory. Government buildings burn. Much of Constantinople is destroyed. According to ancient historians, Justinian himself considers fleeing the city before his wife, Empress Theodora, refuses to abandon the throne. Her reported words become legendary. Royal purple, she supposedly says, makes a fine burial shroud. Whether or not the quote is entirely accurate, what matters is that Justinian stays. Imperial troops trap the rioters inside the Hippodrome and slaughter them. Estimates suggest around 30,000 people die. Constantinople survives. Barely. and then Justinian rebuilds it even grander than before. From the ashes of the riots rises one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history, Hagia Sophia. Completed in just 5 years, its enormous dome appears to float above the city itself. Contemporary writers describe crowds entering the church and weeping at the sight of it. For nearly 1,000 years, it will remain the largest cathedral on earth. But just as Constantinople reaches the height of its glory, a far deadlier threat arrives from the east: disease. The plague arrives in Constantinople in 541 AD, probably carried aboard grain ships from Egypt. At first, people barely understand what they're looking at. Then the bodies start piling up. Victims develop fever, delirium, and swollen black buboes across their bodies before dying in agony. Contemporary historian Procopius describes entire districts falling silent except for funeral processions. At the height of the outbreak, estimates suggest thousands are dying every single day. Corpses overflow cemeteries. Mass graves are dug outside the walls. Some accounts claim there are so many dead that bodies are stacked inside towers because there is nowhere else to put them. This becomes known as the Plague of Justinian, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. And it changes Constantinople forever. The empire survives, but weakened. Trade slows. Tax revenues collapse. Armies shrink. Historians still debate exactly how devastating the plague was. But what matters is this. Just as Justinian seemed on the verge of restoring Roman greatness, the empire loses momentum, and its enemies notice. To the east, the Sassanid Persians launched devastating invasions. Then, in the 7th century, an even larger shockwave explodes out of Arabia. Islam. Within decades of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies conquer enormous territories that had belonged to the Byzantines for centuries. Syria falls. Palestine falls. Egypt falls. These are catastrophic losses. Egypt alone had supplied much of Constantinople's grain. Suddenly, the empire that once dominated the Mediterranean is fighting for survival. And then the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate come directly for Constantinople itself. In 674 AD, Arab fleets begin a long siege of the city. It is the first time an Islamic empire attempts to destroy the Byzantine capital. According to chroniclers, Constantinople appears doomed. But the city possesses two enormous advantages: the walls and Greek fire. The Theodosian Walls, built centuries earlier, are among the greatest defensive fortifications ever constructed. Massive stone barriers stretch across the peninsula with towers, gates, and layered defenses specifically designed to absorb invasion after invasion. Meanwhile, Byzantine ships unleash a terrifying weapon known as Greek fire, an incendiary liquid that burns even on water. Historians still do not know exactly how it was made. Arab fleets burn in the Bosporus. The siege fails, and Constantinople survives again. But the danger never fully disappears. Over the next centuries, the Byzantine Empire enters a brutal cycle of recovery and collapse. Emperors are overthrown in palace conspiracies. Religious controversies erupt into violence. Rival generals march armies against one another. Entire dynasties rise and vanish. Yet somehow, the city endures. And culturally, Constantinople becomes unmatched. Its scholars preserve ancient Greek and Roman texts that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Its merchants connect Scandinavia to the Islamic world. Its churches glitter with mosaics of gold and sapphire. Foreign visitors arrive from Western Europe and describe a city so wealthy it seems almost unreal. One medieval traveler writes that the markets overflow with silk, spices, jewels, and treasures from every corner of the known world. But beneath the wealth and ceremony, cracks are beginning to spread through the empire. And soon, those cracks will invite betrayal from the one group Constantinople never expected to fear: Western Christians. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Constantinople is once again one of the richest cities on earth. Its population may have reached 500,000 people, making it vastly larger than most cities in medieval Europe. The harbors along the Golden Horn are packed with merchant vessels from Venice, Genoa, the Islamic world, and the distant lands of the Rus. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from the north, and gold from Africa all pass through the city's markets. The Byzantine emperor rules from the enormous Great Palace, while diplomats from foreign kingdoms arrive hoping to impress or intimidate a civilization that still calls itself Roman. And militarily, the empire experiences a remarkable recovery. Under emperors like Basil II, Byzantine armies reconquer lost territory and crush rival powers. Basil becomes so feared by the Bulgarians that later chroniclers give him the nickname the Bulgar Slayer. According to medieval accounts, after one major victory, he blinds thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers and sends them home guided by every 100th man who still has one eye remaining. Whether the numbers are exaggerated or not, what matters is the message. Byzantium is powerful again, but empires often peak just before they begin to fracture. After Basil's death in 1025, political instability returns. Weak emperors, court conspiracies, corruption, and aristocratic rivalries slowly undermine the state. The army deteriorates. Provinces become harder to defend. And then, from Central Asia, a new force enters the Middle East. The Seljuk Turks. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire suffers one of the worst military disasters in its history at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantine army is shattered. The emperor himself is captured. And over the following years, much of Anatolia, the empire's heartland and recruiting base, slips from imperial control. Constantinople is suddenly exposed in ways it has not been for centuries. Desperate for military assistance, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sends appeals westward to Christian Europe asking for mercenary support against the Turks. What arrives instead is something far larger. The Crusades. At first, the First Crusade actually helps Byzantium. Crusader armies pass through Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land, and some lost territories are temporarily recovered. But tensions between Eastern Orthodox Byzantines and Western Catholic Crusaders are constant. The Byzantines see the Crusaders as violent, arrogant, and unpredictable. The Crusaders view Constantinople as wealthy, suspicious, and not entirely trustworthy. And the mistrust keeps growing. Then, in 1204, catastrophe strikes. The Fourth Crusade, originally intended to attack Muslim-controlled Egypt, spirals completely out of control. Manipulated by political intrigue, debt, and Venetian interests, the Crusaders turn against Constantinople itself. What happens next shocks even medieval observers hardened by war. The Crusaders storm the city. For 3 days, Constantinople is looted, burned, and desecrated. Churches are stripped of gold and relics. Priceless works of ancient art vanish forever. Nuns are assaulted. Civilians are murdered in the streets. According to Byzantine chroniclers, the destruction inflicted by fellow Christians feels more horrifying than anything inflicted by foreign enemies. The city that had survived Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and countless sieges falls not to Islam, but to the armies of Western Europe. And Constantinople never fully recovers from it. After the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople enters one of the darkest periods in its entire history. The Crusaders establish what they call the Latin Empire, placing Western rulers on the Byzantine throne and carving up former imperial territory among themselves. But the conquest is a disaster. Trade networks collapse. Entire districts of the city fall into ruin. Palaces decay. Churches are abandoned. The enormous wealth that once dazzled visitors across the medieval world is systematically drained away. And outside the walls, the Byzantine world fractures into competing successor states. Greek rulers flee and establish rival centers of power in places like Nicaea and Trebizond, all claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. For decades, Constantinople remains under Latin occupation, but the Crusaders never truly control the wider region. They hold the city, but not the old empire that sustained it. Then, in 1261, the Byzantines take Constantinople back. For a moment, it seems like the empire might recover. The forces of Michael VIII Palaiologos recapture the city while much of the Latin garrison is absent. Byzantine banners once again fly above the walls. Churches are reconsecrated. Orthodox rule is restored. Historians describe scenes of celebration echoing through Hagia Sophia as Constantinople returns to Byzantine hands after nearly 60 years. But the restoration hides a brutal truth. The city is exhausted. Entire neighborhoods stand empty. Population levels have collapsed. The treasury is weak. Trade is increasingly dominated by Italian merchant republics like Venice and Genoa, who establish powerful commercial enclaves inside the city itself. Constantinople still possesses prestige, history, and enormous symbolic importance. But militarily and economically, the Byzantine Empire is now a shadow of what it once was. And surrounding it, new powers are rising. Most dangerous of all are the Ottomans. Beginning in the late 13th century, a small Turkish principality in northwestern Anatolia starts expanding rapidly under leaders like Osman I and Orhan. At first, the Byzantines barely recognized the threat. The empire has survived so many enemies before that another frontier state does not seem particularly alarming. That assumption proves catastrophic. Over the next century, the Ottomans absorb Byzantine territory piece by piece. Cities fall, fortresses surrender, trade routes disappear. Byzantine emperors become increasingly dependent on foreign aid, diplomacy, and mercenaries just to survive. Civil wars inside the empire make things even worse, with rival claimants sometimes inviting Ottoman forces into Byzantine politics itself. And slowly, Constantinople becomes isolated. By the early 1400s, the Byzantine Empire effectively consists of the capital city and a few scattered territories. Everything else has been swallowed by the Ottomans. Travelers arriving in Constantinople describe enormous stretches of abandoned land within the city walls where farms and gardens now grow between ruined buildings. The population may have fallen below 50,000 people. This is no longer the unstoppable capital that once dominated the Mediterranean. It is a dying empire living inside the memory of its former greatness. But even weakened, Constantinople still possesses something immensely valuable: symbolism. As long as the city stands, the Roman Empire, at least in Byzantine eyes, still exists. And for the rising Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, there can be no lasting Ottoman world empire while Constantinople remains unconquered in the center of it. So in 1453, he prepares to finish what generations of invaders could not. In April 1453, the final siege of Constantinople begins. By this point, the Byzantine Empire is barely an empire at all. Emperor Constantine XI rules a city surrounded almost entirely by Ottoman territory. The defenders number perhaps 7,000 men, including foreign volunteers from Genoa and Venice. Facing them is the army of Sultan Mehmed II, estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, supported by massive cannons unlike anything the city has faced before. And Mehmed is only 21 years old. But he understands exactly what Constantinople represents. To conquer the city would make him the heir to centuries of imperial prestige. It would cement Ottoman dominance between Europe and Asia, and it would finally destroy the last remnant of the Roman Empire. So he prepares carefully. Gigantic cannons pound the Theodosian Walls day after day, shaking defenses that had protected Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years. Ottoman ships blockade the harbor. Then Mehmed does something astonishing. To bypass the great defensive chain blocking the Golden Horn, Ottoman forces drag ships over greased wooden tracks across land and launch them into the harbor behind the Byzantine defenses. The defenders wake up and see enemy ships where they should be impossible, and morale collapses. Still, the city refuses to surrender. Priests lead prayers through the streets while civilians help repair damaged walls each night. According to later accounts, many Byzantines believe Constantinople will be saved by divine intervention as it supposedly had been before. But this time, no miracle comes. On May 29th, after weeks of bombardment, Mehmed launches the final assault. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers attack the walls. The fighting becomes desperate and chaotic. Arrows, cannon fire, smoke, and screams engulf the city. Then somewhere near the gate of St. Romanus, Ottoman troops break through. Constantinople falls. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, reportedly throws aside his imperial regalia and charges into the fighting. His body is never definitively identified afterward. According to legend, his final words are, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." After more than 11 centuries, the Byzantine Empire ceases to exist, and the consequences reshape world history. Thousands die during the sack that follows. Churches are looted. Refugees flee westward carrying ancient Greek manuscripts and knowledge preserved for centuries by Byzantine scholars. Historians often argue this intellectual migration helps fuel the Renaissance already beginning in Italy. Meanwhile, Ottoman control of eastern trade routes pushes European kingdoms to search for new sea routes to Asia, indirectly accelerating the age of exploration. In other words, the fall of Constantinople helps trigger the modern world. But the city itself does not disappear. Instead, Mehmed transforms it. Almost immediately, the Ottoman Sultan begins rebuilding Constantinople as the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Hagia Sophia is converted into a mosque. New markets, palaces, baths, and schools rise across the city. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities are encouraged to settle there. Population returns. Trade revives. And over the next centuries, the city once known as Constantinople becomes one of the great capitals of the Islamic world. A new empire has inherited the old one. But even as the Ottoman crescent rises above the skyline, echoes of Rome still linger in the stones beneath it. Under Ottoman rule, Constantinople enters yet another transformation. Mehmed II does not want a ruined city. He wants an imperial capital worthy of a world empire. So almost immediately after the conquest, reconstruction begins on a massive scale. New mosques rise beside ancient churches. Markets expand through the old Roman streets. Entire populations are relocated into the city to restore commerce and life. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all become part of the Ottoman capital, creating one of the most diverse urban centers on earth. And slowly, Constantinople becomes Istanbul. The Ottomans build aggressively. The Grand Bazaar grows into one of the largest covered markets in the world. The Topkapi Palace overlooks the Bosporus as the political center of a rapidly expanding empire. Great imperial mosques reshape the skyline with enormous domes and slender minarets that deliberately echo the architectural legacy of Hagia Sophia. Ottoman architects study the old Byzantine structures carefully, then adapt and surpass them in their own style. And the empire surrounding the city becomes immense. By the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire stretches across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Istanbul stands at the center of it all. Trade caravans arrive from Persia and Arabia. Ships crowd the Bosporus carrying goods between continents. Diplomats from European kingdoms enter the city both fascinated and intimidated by Ottoman power. For centuries, Istanbul becomes one of the great capitals of the world. But empires never stop changing. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire faces mounting pressure from industrializing European powers. Military defeats accumulate. Nationalist revolts spread across imperial territory. Corruption and economic stagnation weaken the state from within. European politicians increasingly refer to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. And once again, the future of the city becomes uncertain. Yet Istanbul remains symbolically powerful. Railways arrive. Western architecture appears beside ancient mosques. Newspapers, factories, and modern bureaucracies transform daily life. Reform movements attempt to modernize the empire before collapse becomes unavoidable. But then comes the First World War. The Ottoman Empire joins the Central Powers and suffers catastrophic defeat. By the end of the war, Allied forces occupy Istanbul itself. Foreign warships anchor in the Bosporus. For many Ottomans, it feels as though history is repeating itself. Another empire centered on this city is collapsing before the eyes of the world. And then a new figure emerges. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Leading the Turkish War of Independence, Ataturk defeats foreign occupation forces and abolishes the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922. 1 year later, the Republic of Turkey is officially established. The capital moves to Ankara, ending Istanbul's role as the political center of empire after nearly 16 centuries. But the city remains the cultural and historical heart of the region. And in 1930, Turkey formally adopts the name Istanbul internationally, though variations of the name had already been used informally for generations. The old imperial identity fades. The republic embraces secular reforms, modernization, and a new national future. Yet everywhere across the city, the past refuses to disappear. Roman columns still stand beside Ottoman fountains. Byzantine cisterns lie hidden beneath crowded streets. Church mosaics survive beneath mosque domes. Ferries still cross the Bosporus exactly where Greek colonists sailed thousands of years earlier. Because Istanbul is not simply one city. It is layer upon layer of civilizations built on top of each other across nearly 3 millennia of human history. Today, Istanbul is home to more than 15 million people. It is one of the largest cities on Earth, a place where container ships pass medieval fortresses, where the call to prayer echoes across highways and skyscrapers, and where millions cross between Europe and Asia every single day, often without thinking about how many empires stood here before them. But the history of Constantinople still surrounds the city like a shadow. The old Theodosian Walls still cut across the landscape, scarred but standing after surviving more than 15 centuries of war and siege. Hagia Sophia still dominates the skyline, transformed from church to mosque to museum and back to mosque again, carrying the layered identity of every civilization that claimed it. Deep beneath modern streets, Byzantine cisterns and Roman foundations remain hidden underground, reminders that entire worlds still exist beneath the modern city. And perhaps that's what makes Constantinople so extraordinary. Most ancient capitals eventually disappear. Some are abandoned. Some shrink into ruins. Some survive only in books. But Constantinople never truly died. It simply changed identities over and over again. Greek colony, Roman capital, Byzantine stronghold, Ottoman imperial center, modern Turkish megacity. Few places on Earth have reinvented themselves so many times. And throughout all those transformations, one thing remained constant: geography. The Bosporus still matters just as much today as it did when Greek settlers first arrived nearly 3,000 years ago. Control of trade, movement, and strategic access between continents still shapes global politics. Historians often point out that the city's location almost guaranteed its importance long before any empire existed there. What changed were the people, religions, languages, and flags ruling above it. But then again, maybe that's the real story of Constantinople. Not permanence, survival. Because this city endured things that should have destroyed it countless times over. Plagues that emptied its streets. Riots that burned entire districts to the ground. Crusaders who looted its churches. Cannons that shattered its legendary walls. The collapse of empires that once seemed eternal. And still the city lived on. Even the name, Constantinople, still carries emotional weight centuries after the city officially became Istanbul. To Christians, Muslims, Europeans, Turks, and historians alike, it represents something larger than a single place. It symbolizes the collision of civilizations, East and West, Christianity and Islam, ancient and modern worlds layered on top of each other across thousands of years. That's why the city continues to fascinate people today. Because when you walk through Istanbul, you are not walking through one era of history. You are walking through all of them at once. If you've enjoyed this journey through the history of Constantinople, do leave a like. It genuinely helps more people discover these videos. And if you want to keep exploring the rise and fall of civilizations, empires, and the world's greatest cities, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past. And as always, we'll see you in history.